Hello, and thank you for coming along. Today we're going to be exploring the history and cultures of Ghana, Africa, and the Atlantic world as part of an update for the Ghana Studies Association. We're going to look first at Kwame Akoto Bamfo, an artist who has been, in effect, reaching out to the American public in a very dramatic way, using his art as a way of communicating. In the past, Black History Month has dealt a lot with the achievements of American Black intellectuals, businessmen, athletes, historians. A whole group of people have emerged in our consciousness because of their contributions over the years, especially in political activism and leadership on a national level. But Black History Month is now at the point of being able to transcend any one tradition within a nation state and talk about the history of the Black African diaspora. Kwame Akoto Bamfo has been a very powerful voice and force in this movement. He's used art to build restorative justice across the African diaspora. And just this last month, the Beinecke Library at Yale University arranged a Zoom conference with him, which is now publicly available, and gives a great example of the importance of the African diaspora in this Black History Month, just a month later after he gave his presentation. Let's look briefly at what they say. In effect, he joined them for a Zoom session and described what he was doing from his home in Ghana. He's attempting to build restorative justice across the African diaspora, not just those in West Africa and the United States, but throughout the Caribbean and South America as well. He's done this by, in effect, presenting public statues cast in bronze in such a way that people have to encounter them in public space. A lot of them are covered on YouTube, and you can find access to them through Transition Studies or through the Beinecke Library at Yale that have posted this particular interview with him. His things are very powerful, his presentations, or as they call them in the art world, the installations. As in this case, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama commissioned this work, a memorial to the lingering horror of lynching. You can see its dimensions from afar outside their impressive building, but up close it's even more dramatic. These are public statements about what's been forgotten in large parts of American history and what needs to be recalled. Similar statues like this have been poised in public space, and people have responded to them. They've been asked to write statements to put on signs so that the public can see public reactions to these things. In Ghana, Kwame Akoto Bamfo has his workshop toward the eastern part of Ghana, and he started to install a massive artwork that's taken years and will take years more. The BBC has covered this to some extent, and again, you can look at the interviews and the coverage of it on Transition Studies by looking up his name, Kwame Akoto Bamfo, in the search engine. He's created what he calls the Ancestor Project, which is a way of remembering those who are nameless victims, and nameless participants in the African slave trade. This one in particular outlines the YouTube, for YouTube, on the YouTube internet access, how an artist uses sculpture to tell African history. I'd urge you to view it. One of the most powerful interviews with him was covered in Monument Lab by a woman named Rachel Ama-Asa Engman. Rachel Engman is a very interesting member of the African diaspora herself. She's a descendant of one of the members in the 18th century who engaged in the slave trade. She teaches at Hampshire College, and she's an archaeologist. She's begun to look into the archaeology of the slaver in the 18th century Ghana. So this is a very interesting comment that she's made by way of interviewing Kwame in his work has underscored the link between the diaspora. She's gone back to Africa as an archaeologist, and as it says, professor with Ghanaian roots, unearths a slave castle and its history in her own world. She's done this through a group of volunteers and activists in Ghana who work with her on this archaeological dig in what's known as the Osu Castle, used for a long time as a government building after the slave trade. We should look at the interviews with her. One called Up Close with Professor Ama-Asa Engman is particularly interesting. It shows the gate going into the Osu Castle, which if you look at in detail will indicate a date of 1730, when it was built by Ghanaian laborers to be a castle in the slave trade. Going at this with students and volunteers is a very challenging task in the tropics. It's hard to keep work going in an area that has heavy rains, but very careful work can be done and is being done by Rachel Engman with her team as part of a project, which is, as they say in their own statement, rewriting Ghanaian history through archaeological excavations. She's developed it as an archaeological project. She calls it the Christianborg Archaeological Heritage Project. It's called Christianborg because that was the name of the castle at the time it was built. It's become since known as the Osu Castle. But they have a publicly accessible website, and those interested in the diaspora history of those coming from Africa and those going back to Africa would learn a lot by exploring its website. There were many castles along the coast that became known as the Gold Coast and later as Ghana that were illustrated in European publications from the 1600s onwards. This one in particular is a French publication from 1719 and indicates how many of these forts and castles existed. Other travelogues include profiles of particular castles and, in fact, very detailed diagrams of what they looked like on the outside and the inside. It's possible then to look through some of these old publications published during the time of the slave trade and inform the archaeologists about the kinds of places they should look and the kinds of work that can be undertaken to discover more about the slave trade. This then is a very interesting complement to the work of Kwame Akoto. His ancestor project reaches out, in a way, to talk about areas from Ghana to the New World and to Europe. In addition, there's an interesting reverse kind of flow that is now occurring as people examine the Atlantic slave wars that took place. A very famous one is Taki's Revolt. It's been studied by a close friend of Henry Louis Gates. In fact, Henry Louis Gates Jr. introduced the discussion of the book because it's now come out in paperback just this month. And on February 2nd, at the Hutchins Center at Harvard, where Professor Gates is the director, he hosted a session with Vincent Brown, the author of the book, to talk about Taki's Revolt. We're all very familiar with Professor Gates. He's a trusted voice in the realm of American Black history, and his work is very rightly celebrated. He's the host and executive producer of Finding Your Roots, which we've all heard about. And in addition, he's hosted a whole series of programs entitled Many Rivers to Cross on the history of Black Africa. In addition, he's reached out to look at Blacks in Latin America in a very powerful way. And he's hosted in recent years, in fact, in recent months, a series of very important conversations with African historians, Caribbean historians, and American historians, like John Thornton, who is one of the world's greatest authorities on the history of the Congo region. In addition, he just this month, on February 18th, in fact, created a program with David Blight, the award-winning, in fact, multiple award-winning historian at Yale University, where Henry Louis Gates began his own study of African culture and history about 50 years ago. His contribution is widely acknowledged. In fact, in Black History Month, The New Yorker ran a lead article entitled How Henry Louis Gates Jr. Helped Remake the Literary Canon, speaking of his work, particularly in the criticism of English literature. But well beyond that, Professor Gates has encouraged others to look at the history and culture of the transatlantic and African diaspora populations along trading frontiers that existed in the Atlantic and well into the interior, in the Americas as well. He's done this by respecting the importance of maps. Now, Vincent Brown, who's the author of the recent book that came out in paperback just earlier this month, is at Harvard the director of the History Design Studio, known as HDS. And they've been operating for a number of years, facilitating both the study of and the presentation to the public in exhibits of African aspects of culture. It's for this reason that Henry Louis Gates hosted the session with Vincent Brown for the presentation of Taki's Revolt. This is an important contribution last month to Black History Month. Professor Brown held forth for more than an hour on his insights and research in this whole region The slave revolt was a revolt in 1760, the largest single revolt against the British Empire on the island of Jamaica. But its origins can be traced back, as he pointed out in his book and in his talk, to regions within what became known as Ghana, but was known as the Gold Coast at the time, indicated on the map in the box, but also then enlarged. If you look carefully at the map, you can see the names of particular places and an indication of how far it stretched from what is currently Ghana right over until what then was known as the Slave Coast and is now known as Nigeria and Lagos. On the Gold Coast, there was a particular group that emerged in the revolt in Jamaica that traced its origins, if not directly, at least indirectly, to a portion of the Gold Coast. In one popular history of it, written in years since it happened, the revolt in 1760 at St. Mary was very dramatic, and it was led, according to this source, by a Coromantee named Taki. As the source put it then, this Coromantee named Taki had been a chief in Africa. Well, this is part of the story that Vincent Brown uncovers with great detail and traces on the map that he presents in his book to this area where there was, in fact, a slaving fort known as Coromantee at the time. You can see where it's situated in reference to all of West Africa here. And he argued in his beginning chapters that the Coromantee, or Coromantine, had an influence throughout this area. When they arrived in the New World, they kept an awareness of that together, and it served as the basis for the Coromantee revolt. It could be helpful to look at old maps of Africa to learn more about people like the Coromantee, who were so important in the Atlantic slave resistance movements like that of Taki's rebellion. But it's hard to make much of the detail in the early maps of Africa, unless you get beyond the continent as a whole and start to piece together in a digital form the overlapping maps that were kept by those engaged in the slave trade. This is work that's being done by a group called the Africa Map Circle, and they're sharing their research online in order for others to look into these materials with expertise of their own, and for people to exchange their information back and forth across different disciplines, histories, and anthropological and historical disciplines, both in the United States, in Africa, and in Europe itself. Many of the maps, for example, were drawn by Dutch enterprises before the English and before the French. The Dutch were dominant on the Gold Coast and elsewhere in Africa, South Africa in particular. So old maps, picks and shovels are things that are being revived at this point to look at steps towards an archaeology of the Atlantic trade. If you look carefully at the maps, you can find out a great deal, especially in areas that Europeans had a lot of interest in. There are large blanks on the maps, but then it seems areas of great interest and a lot of attention. You can look at some of these in the historical map collections like Afroterra, a private collection of African maps that's been made available online for researchers all over the world. If you look at some of these maps, drawn in some cases in their stark outlines, in other cases they've been painted in by people who've looked at them since, in order to make sense of the different political groups and different kingdoms that were thought to exist at the time. As in this 1729 map of a French cartographer called Danville. If you blow them up, you can learn quite a bit as well. And in fact, they've been made available in a way online by Afroterra, which you can reach at afroterra.com, in order to look at these sources. And you can blow them up in the magnification that's provided. Sure enough, in the English language version of this early map, you can find the Fanti country, said to be rich and powerful. And it has an indication of Cormontine, spelled here with a K, and an H after it, indicating that it was a Dutch fort to begin with. Then they refer to the mountains of Cormontine. It's this whole region, some of which, for example, here is said to be subject to Fantine, the area of Fantine country, also known as the Fanti in later maps of the Gold Coast. In any case, the detailed study of these maps at afroterra.org, not .com, but afroterra.org, allows you to look in great detail at the maps of the period. And for this reason, there's been a movement to take a new look at old maps, particularly look at the prior plantations and the provisioning of the African maritime trade across the Atlantic. New digital techniques are being developed as well to lay these maps on top of the Google Earth substrate and study things like stones and plants. These are major structures. They didn't build themselves. They required a lot of manpower. That manpower required a lot of food. And some calculation needs now to be done at what is in effect written in stone in West Africa. The silent and eerie eloquence of these stone structures has beneath them and behind them an enormous structure of production that needs to be examined. An exhibit was held at Harvard back in 2019 entitled Maps, Stones, and Plants, looking at agents of empire and the ecology of the Atlantic trade. And when you look at the map in detail, you can see that there's a flag planted here very, very densely along the whole range of the coast. A fort, a castle, a redoubt of some kind, a trading spot in the slave trade. Vincent Brown knew about these because he's the director of HDS, the Harvard Design Studio that held this group exhibit. In the 19th century, those very same castles were used to organize invasion forces by Europeans, in this case the British, who marched on Kumasi from the coast to capture the king's palace and the territory around the Ashanti Empire, around Kumasi. In the process, by the way, they used West Indian troops to assist the invasion force. This led to a whole new dimension that needs to be explored, along with a whole series of other questions about captured riches. The illustrations at the time indicated what they called the artifacts and trophies of the Akan in Ashanti that were appropriated by the European captives, including a very famous and impressive mask in gold. University of Cape Coast in Ghana has started to look into these things, and the Department of History called for a series of papers. They asked the question, what should be done with the looted colonial treasures like these that were documented at the time as being taken? And they were sold off, in some cases like this, in open auction to the troops, where Sir Garnet Wolseley, the head of the whole operation of the Ashanti campaign in 1873 and 74, sat by as these things were auctioned. This wasn't haphazard. What should be done with this looted treasure? It now exists largely in museums throughout America and in Europe. In effect, what can Africa recover from its looted colonial past? Well, the question has been posed thanks to the scholars of the University of Cape Coast who put together a colloquium last year at the end of 2021 to look at this question. In July last year, they issued a call for papers on repatriation in Africa, the African diaspora, and other global contexts, histories, practices, understandings, and constructions. And they held an impressive conference in the University of Cape Coast by virtual communication. It was a Zoom conference. In many respects, the Department of History there is an ideal group to initiate this internal conversation because the Cape Coast Castle, pictured here, during the slave trade period, and here as part of that period of European conquest, is still existing. And now at Cape Coast, the town in which the university operates. So their first ever conference internationally to invite people to join by Zoom was quite a breakthrough in many respects and a model of what can be done in the future. University of Cape Coast, College of the Humanities and Legal Studies put this forward as a powerful new kind of initiative. It's held a bold new conference that can bring together scholars from around the world, and it deserves this kind of support in the future. In this manner, the faculty and students at UCC, the University of Cape Coast, can now substantially advance international conversations on repatriating African history in the months and years ahead. And since these things can be conveyed by QR codes, students from every tradition, both in Africa, in America, and certainly as part of Black History Month, can scan in the codes and on their cell phones begin to read about the problems that are being faced in reference to the Africa diaspora and its heritage in the transatlantic trade. The Ancestor Project of Kwame Okoto-Bamfo had the intention of reaching out specifically to the Americas, but the dimensions have been expanded in a sense by Vincent Brown and others who've drawn attention to the nature of the revolts in the American colonies and the fact that they're part of a larger pattern of resistance and, as he calls it, the Atlantic Slave War. Henry Louis Gates has not only recognized it, but supported this material from the outset. The Harvard Design Studio is a subset, a portion, a program within the Hutchins Center, directed by Henry Louis Gates, Jr. So, in celebrating Black History Month, we've been looking briefly at the history and cultures of Ghana, Africa, and the Atlantic world. Scan in the code, discover more on your own. Thank you.